Hello. Today we're going to look at planting in containers. First, we're going to look at why we plant in containers. Second, the things to consider when choosing a suitable container. And three, we can look at some examples. Why would we choose to plant in containers? Well, I have a few ideas that come to mind. This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives us a few ideas for why. First thing is we want to start seeds, often in greenhouses or indoors, to protect them against pests in their early days, and sometimes just to get a little bit longer growing season by starting the seeds a couple of weeks earlier than when we plant them outdoors. Another reason is simply we have no soil. We have a balcony or a terrace or even a window box, so we need a place to put our plants, so we put them in containers. Another thing is growing conditions. Sometimes the growing conditions in our garden may not be ideal for the plant we want to grow. The soil may not be correct, may not have the right acidity or the type of soil or even the watering. So we'll grow our plants separately in a container. Another thing is portability. If we want to move the plants around from time to time in different parts of our green space, or if we want to offer them to friends, then of course we put them in a little container of some form. Another thing is style. Some containers are very chic, and perhaps we'll want to put our plants in our fancy pots to have a certain style in the garden. Another thing is vertical growing up walls, for example. Sometimes we use containers for that. And another thing is ease of use. If we have high raised growing containers, often it's easier, certainly if we have any kind of limitation in our manoeuvrability, in movement, a raised bed can make life a whole lot easier. And one last thing I'd like to add is sometimes we need to confine invasive plants. One plant that comes to mind is mint. If left in the garden, it will invade the garden and take over. So sometimes we like to put plants like that in a container so that it is contained. What do we need to consider when choosing a pot? Okay, first thing to kick off is robustness. Something that's going to be outside or even indoors needs to be able to last a certain time. So, for example, a pot obviously made out of cardboard is going to disintegrate the first time we actually water the plant. So we have to think about what is it made of and how long will it last. The common choices are usually plastic or terracotta, but they could be things like metal or all sorts of other materials. Another important factor is size. We need to have a container which is big enough for the plant. If we consider this, it's a minuscule pot, and I've actually bought plants that were in pots this small. That is not going to be able to contain very much. So we may have to consider something a little bit more impressive. So size is extremely important here when we're talking about plants, and the bigger the pot, the less watering we have to do. The material that the pot is made from, of course, is extremely important too. Plastic needs to be watered a lot less than terracotta, for example. Another important thing is drainage. we can't put things in a sealed container because it will fill up with water and will actually, what we call, drown the plant. Basically the plant will start to rot in too much water. So all of these pots in general have a hole at the bottom to allow water to escape, to ensure the right level of water for the plant. Unless of course it's an aquatic or semi-aquatic plant, in which case the rules change a little there. And one more thing to consider is, particularly when you're recycling containers, as I do a lot, if the container has contained toxic materials like paints or glues or chemicals, you have to be very, very careful. In general, it's a good idea to avoid them. But if you are going to plant in them, ensure that you put in plants that you're not going to eat. So even if the chemicals leach out from the container into the soil and into the plant, at least you're not going to consume them and have those poisonous chemicals in your body. We're going to look at some examples now. And here I'm going to show you simple potting for potting seeds when we want to protect them from pests, or, as I said, to prolong our growing season at the start of the season. Now here I have some very simple biodegradable pots, which are made out of wood pulp, I think. And also I've got a little lollipop stick for each pot that I saved from previous summers, where I can note what is actually in the pot, because once it's in the pot we're not quite sure afterwards, particularly if we mix up the pots, what's in there. So what I'm going to plant very simply today is here some courgettes, or zucchini as they're called. And very simply I take the rather large seed and I plant it in the pot like so. And so it goes in about 1 centimetre, that's about half an inch. Notice, yes, that is the right one. The ones for courgette or zucchini have got a C on the little stick. You just do like that for these, and then we're going to follow them with some gherkins, or in the States we call them pickles. They're very similar plants, so I have to be very careful that they are well labelled, because even when they're growing they'll be extremely difficult to tell apart. Actually, a good thing to do usually when you're planting is to plant maybe a couple of seeds in each pot, but as I only need about 2 or 3 plants of each, it doesn't really matter, because I'm actually planting 6 different pots here for each of them, so even if a couple of them don't come up, it doesn't really matter. But I'm putting an extra seed in there, and maybe we'll do the same with the courgette or zucchini. That way we're doubling our chances in each one. One thing, when you're seeding these particular seeds, it's always a good idea to plant them with the very thin edge pointing upwards, not the flat surface, so that water doesn't collect and maybe actually stay on the surface of the seed and cause it to rot. So there's one of our first uses of containers. Here I've decided to plant in bins. Prepared one here to show you, which already has holes in it to allow for drainage, and I've marked each of the bins with what's going in them. The first bin which we're going to fill now is for carrots, as we can see here. The reason I chose bins was simply because this part of the garden is actually on a concrete slab, so there's no actual soil here, so I needed to plant in containers. And the other thing is, for carrots need fine soil that they can push through, and my garden is mostly clay, so it's absolutely unsuitable for carrots. So we've got suitable soil here in an area where we normally can't grow, simply because there's a concrete slab under these bins. So here's an example of where I want to pot a plant, because in fact I'm going to put it in this pot and possibly move it around a little bit in the garden. So here I've got portability, mobility. So very simple. Take the plant into its little pot, there, plant it in the pot just up to where it comes out of its soil from its original pot. And all we need now to do is water it and place it where we want it. So we've done a little tour of planting in containers. Some people prefer planting in containers, and even if they have large gardens, they still prefer to put their prized plants in containers for the reasons we've seen. Before I had a garden, I lived in a little apartment with a balcony, and my balcony was stacked high with pots and containers full of plants. Fortunately, I had a very strong balcony which could take the weight, but it was a little jungle in pots. Now, are there any disadvantages with planting in containers? There's one that I would like to cover, and that's watering. Now, a garden is full of soil, which is like a big sponge. So when it rains, the soil absorbs the rain and holds it and gives it back to the plants when the weather starts to get dry. So watering is minimal because we have this reserve of water in the garden. Pots, of course, are a lot smaller. So the smaller the pot, the more often we need to water, because the water will, 1, drain out of the pot, 2, feed the plant, and 3, evaporate, particularly in hot weather. So if you are considering having a lot of pots and you don't feel like going around watering them manually every day, maybe it would be a good idea to think about an automatic watering system.